Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. We are live. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Today I'm joined by my host, the man who was turned into some sort of Sasquatch down there in Ireland, Kieran O'Regan. Kieran, how you doing?
Good. No, it's the COVID haircut. That's what I'm saying. I'm getting increasingly homeless looking. But that was my excuse. The COVID haircut was the excuse until the barber shops reopened, and I have to come up with something else now.
Okay, so we'll just call you the fucking Jippo. Can you say Jippo, or is that allowed now? Is that like derogatory?
Travelers, I believe, isn't it?
Travelers. Then that is the sound of Sonny Brown. Kieran, are you still there?
I am, yeah.
Oh, I thought you just ignored me. You just looked down and ignored me. I thought I offended you. Can you say Jippo anymore?
I didn't want to partake in your derogatory remark about the traveling community.
Is that derogatory now? I saw that during the week. We'll just go into this. So you can't say Jippo, gypsy, knacker, tinker. No.
No. That was made pretty clear in Snatch. You know, you can't Snatch that made that like that cultural study masterpiece. You can't. Dire consequences.
I can never tell if you're fucking serious or not. Right, let's go with this episode. Let's not get down the rabbit hole here because Kieran's trying to bait me. Let's talk to our guest because Kieran's trying to bait me into something. This evening we are joined, well, this morning, depending on where you are. It's evening for me, it's very late evening for Sonny, and it's midday for Kieran in Ireland. We have Sonny Brown from the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Sonny, how are we doing?
Doing pretty well. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Kieran, for having me on. And very interested to have this discussion, touching on the Book of Five Rings. And as you mentioned before, you guys have been hard at it, and there'll probably be a lot more to go. So digging deep into this book. Yeah. So for people listening to this in isolation, we've been breaking down the Book of Five Rings. Myself and Kieran, we're going chapter by chapter from the introduction. It's an awesome book. You can download it free. Just go down there to the show notes. Kieran will have plenty of links in there for you to click on and play around with. So, Sonny, where are you based today? Sydney, northern beaches of Sydney. Same old. And just actually my birthday today. So
happy birthday, Sonny.
What better way to spend it than talking to you, mate?
Oh my God, this is brilliant. How fucking shit is your life? Now, there is some background here. So people listening going, oh my God, he's so rude to that guest. I have known Sonny for a number of years. And if you go over to my other sister podcast, Sleep for Performance Radio, you'll see I've interviewed Sonny there before about some of his other work. And I've been on Sonny's podcast as well, the Sonny Brown Breakdown, which I highly recommend to go and have a listen to, and some of these videos on YouTube as well, the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, as way of introduction, let's do this properly. Let's get into this and stop taking the piss out of Sonny. Let's do this. So for those of you watching, you will see now on screen, I am going to share some great information here about our guest. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the body. That is the body of an athlete. I presume from the laughter, Sonny can hear it. And if you want, go to Tapology. Now, for those of you who are new to MMA, Tapology was the place to go back in the Stone Age when MMA fighters were emerging. And there is Sonny Brown. Look at him weighing in at 70 kilos, 155 in the old money. Look at that. That man was a specimen. Is that you, Sonny?
That's me. That's actually after a loss. So, that's when I'm looking down, somewhat dejected. after being beaten in front of a large audience of fans and friends. So, you're going to have those moments.
I thought you were just pissed off over your abs. So if you look down here on the fighters' details, we can fill in some of these. We got Sonny Brown as the name. The nickname is the King. We'll just give him the King Brown because King Brown is a snake here in Australia. And date of birth, if you're wondering, today is the 15th of June. There you go. We've filled in his date of birth as well.
There you go.
It says here that Sonny's disclosed earnings is $0.
may as well be, mate. I'll tell you. It's not far off it.
Kieran, do you think this is real or do you think Sonny's hiding us on here?
I don't know. Maybe that's just undisclosed for the tax purposes.
Maybe that's exactly what I was thinking as well. So anyway, Sonny there has a very impressive record. Down the bottom there, you can go there and have a look at that. Some of the names there you might have seen from the UFC. But that is a world gone by. So Sonny, let's just take a step back. How did you get into martial arts? What led you down the path of martial arts?
It was, the initial decision to start training was really for, the health, physical benefits of training and doing something, because I'd grown up playing a lot of sport, but not martial arts actually. And then had stopped doing it in early 20s, and just when you become of legal age to go to the pubs down here, that seemed like a far better way to spend your weekends than football for me. But after a while that got a bit boring as well. So I'd seen mixed martial arts, I'd seen the early UFCs, and I was lucky enough to have a place just down the road where Elvis Sinisic had trained, the first UFC fighter from Australia. And it was kind of just a thing of, okay, let's go start this. Seems like fun to kind of get involved, but then I never actually had the intention of definitely fighting for sure when I started. But you know how these things happen. After a while, you keep showing up at a place where they get people into fights, and eventually you're going to get into a fight, I guess.
And growing up, like, were you ever in like a schoolyard fight? Did you ever have a fight outside a pub, maybe outside the Stein there, the Manly, down the Corso?
Yeah, I got a few stories about the Stein or the Drain, as we know it.
I was drunk in there back in 2000.
Mate, yeah, me too. Could have been there at the same time.
We could have fought.
So, I probably grew up actually, influenced by media. Of course, Van Damme, Jackie Chan movies, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, big one. And actually pro wrestling started, I watched as a kid. So we would, have mock pro wrestling bouts at school. I remember actually we also had fairly real sparring matches in high school, where we used to bring some boxing gloves to school and set up a little pit on the school oval. I'm just remembering it now. and we'd start sparring, and it would be a spectacle for everyone to come and watch until the science teachers got a wind of what we were doing, and eventually had a squad form to come and break it up from all angles. But that was good fun.
Yeah.
As a coincidence, I think I had to double check there who he was fighting, but I think Elvis Sinosic was on one of the first UFC cards I ever saw. It was him fighting Michael Bisping.
Yeah.
So did he?
Yeah, I remember Bisping. He fought Michael Bisping, UFC 70. It's one of the first UFC cards I ever saw.
Yeah, but I remember the one that George St. Pierre lost to Matt Serra on, if I remember.
Was it?
I think so. But
yeah, I agree.
If you looked at that record, I have been knocked out a couple of times. So take any of my recollection of facts with a grain of salt.
No, it very well could be, because there was that one, and it was around then I started watching, and I was like, Elvis Sinosic. I remember Michael Bisping coming out with his, he used to have that kind of thug, like shaved head, and kind of like Nike Air Maxes and like camo shorts. Joe, this kind of thing, just like, whoa, England, yeah, Joe, this kind of stuff. And he came over there.
Exactly what he was like.
Yeah. It was like he just kind of like strode out, like, and I used to just love. It was like the character, like, but yeah, that was a UFC 70. It might very well have been, as I think UFC 74 or 5 then was Rampage and Dan Henderson or something like that. I think, if I remember correctly, that was soon afterwards.
Yeah, I just looking at the card here now, Kieran. I just threw it up there on the screen. You're right. Gabriel Gonzaga versus Mirko Krokop. That's when Gonzaga Krokop and he head kicked him. And Gonzaga was the jiu-jitsu guy, and then he ended up like Krokop, and Krokop is Andrei Arlovsky and Fabricio Verdum. Bisping beat Cynic Elvis. That was at light heavyweight. Machida, Czech Congo.
Machida.
Jesus, Paul Taylor from England. Do you remember him?
Yeah, he was good, and I think. Oh, actually, I won't recall that fact about possibly he was arrested for something because of
Paul Taylor.
If I got the if I got the headliner wrong,
let's look it up.
I don't want to go throwing those around.
I'm just hearing someone here on Wikipedia, and doesn't say anything there.
It was probably someone he fought. I think I've got a habit of just merging a couple of different memories together,
If you want to see a fight, lads, if you really want to see a fight that is absolutely ballistic from old school UFC, Paul Taylor versus, and I want to get the name right here, I think it was Paul Kelly, another English guy. Is that his name?
Yeah.
Paul Kelly.
Yeah.
UFC 80. They just stood in the middle. That was UFC 80 called Rapid Fire. And I believe, before I even scroll down, was this BJ Penn versus Daddy Stevenson's?
Ooh, that was a crazy fight too.
If it was, we'll see if that was UFC 80. And I tell you, lads, they just stood in the pocket and they smiled, high-fived, and just went for it. Yeah, rapid fire. BJ Penn versus Joe Daddy Stevenson. That's when BJ bet the shit out of Joe Stevenson, got up and licked the blood off the back of his hands.
Still cringe at that one.
Scary shit.
Yeah, so, and if I just to jump in on the your own podcast, Sonny, so I've listened to a few of the episodes since we organized this, and I come across, and I went right back to the start, and one of the episodes I listened to was with, his name's after escaping me, but it was with a teacher who's a jiu-jitsu coach.
Yeah.
And it was in that he had mentioned the Book of Five Rings, and was that where you had come across the Book of Five Rings?
No, I'd come across it earlier than that. I remember, I remember making notes from the book one time when I was competing in a jiu-jitsu competition down in Melbourne. So I'd traveled down and I went to the library the day before, and I was making notes of it in a notebook I had. So that probably would have been one of the first times I'd gone through it. And I imagine about like 20, I just roughly say maybe 2010, 2009, something like that. That was the first I come across it. I don't know exactly, I can't remember exactly where I heard about it first. But I mean, it is such a widely known book. It could have come from a bunch of different sources. And
did you just happen to come across it per chance in that library?
No, I'd bought it. So I'd purchased it and had taken it down with me. And I'm thinking, I'm vaguely remembering like checking to make sure I got a translation that I wanted. Because I think there was 2 translations of it potentially. And yeah, I wanted to make sure I got the right translation one,
Yeah. And how did you actually even how did you come across it? Like, it's such a, like, where did you even hear about it or encounter it in 2010? Like, where?
That's what I can't remember exactly, but I mean, I come across just a lot of things by, like, I've got a wide variety of different books, music and everything, just by kind of following threads and recommendations. Like, I'm always looking for what people are, recommending, and particularly what people that I admire, if they have influences, then I want to find out about what their influences are. And then I want to find out who influenced those people who they admire, who influence the influencers kind of. For the best example I can give for that is liner notes in CDs or vinyl records. Remember those? But they would always put a list of artists we'd like to thank or something like that, and that's a lot of the bands that I found. I would sit down and read the liner notes of a CD and go, okay, well, I like this band, let's see who they thank, and then maybe I'll try and check those guys out, and then I'll just keep going in a cycle like that to find new music, which now has just been replaced by the Spotify algorithm. So that's another time gone by.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like the like even just in it from a scientific sense, like doing a literature review where you just come across, start with a review paper and then go down rabbit holes off the back of that, and then more rabbit holes off that, what they reference in their reference list, and you keep going. Yeah, cool. And do you remember from that early stage, do you remember what you were, because when someone first comes across the Book of Five Rings, I can imagine it to be, because it was like with me, whereas there was a feeling that there was something to it and that there's elements of it that are really useful, but you kind of almost need to be aware enough of martial arts so that you can actually get something tangible from the Book of Five Rings to bring back to martial arts. So there's kind of like, there's a basic understanding of knowledge. There's like almost like a certain level of knowledge that might be kind of a minimum that you'd have to have about your own martial art and martial arts experience to then be actually able to get something tangible from the Book of Five Rings, because he writes in such abstraction, like this kind of poetic abstraction and sometimes like built-in paradox and everything. So do you remember what it was from the get-go that you were able to, that meant you brought it with you to a jiu-jitsu competition, to go to a library and then make notes before the competition? Like, what was tangible about it? Do you remember offhand or anything that was actually useful?
From those notes that I took, and it's an interesting point that I actually probably like to make another set of notes and compare them to the ones that I made back then, to see if my interpretation of what he says has changed now that I've changed myself, and see how that lines up. But I think, there is some kind of gravity given to his words once you know that he killed so many people, for put it bluntly, and he's talking about exactly how he did it, how he was successful at it, and you kind of, it's that, that brings a weight to it that you're like, okay, this guy must have something that's worth listening to. And then I think there is a lot of advice that, there's also a lot of advice that talks specifically about holding the sword and stuff like that, which maybe I still don't get, because I kind of dismissed that at the time as just, well, I'm not fighting with a sword, so I'm not going to use that.
Sonny, can we just pause on that for a second? Because I think that's really interesting, because I just want to, this was something I was going to bring up, and this might as well just jump right into it.
Go for it.
Because a bit like you, when I've read it numerous times, I said this to Karen before, and every time I read it, I get a different interpretation. Every single time. It's like the book that keeps on giving. Like, if you had to put me on a desert island and give me one book, it's probably this book. Every time I read it, it's something different. But I was rereading it again on the weekend. I took one of the books in the middle and I was reading it. And you're more of a jiu-jitsu guy. So Karen's more of a kind of has come from the striking background. But as a jiu-jitsu guy, do you think that the gripping, when he talks about the sword, and Kieran, I'm interested from a striking point of view as well, when he talks about the gripping of the sword, right? The hands in certain places. Do you think, Sonny, this translates to even grabbing the gi in jiu-jitsu? Because I think no matter what, seriously, I think no matter, don't make a face, listen.
I like it.
I think no matter what martial art you're into, you're going to look through the lens. Yes, sword was the predominant thing at the time. But if you think about it and try to use it in a more, like Kieran said, abstract, or apply it to today, I was thinking about the grips on the weekend. Because we're back doing a lot of gi over the winter. I've been using lots of cross-collar grips, lots of sleeves, to set up sweeps and, triangles off of that. And I thought, actually, this grip is what makes everything happen. And there's so many things from the grip. And then I started thinking about the sword grip. So I'll put that question to you, Sonny, first. But before you do, the same question to you, Karen, about how you grip your hand potentially in boxing inside the glove. Is that applicable as well? Or is it more about, because maybe it's the guard of he talks about the different guards in the book, the high guard, the middle guard, the low guard. Is that more about boxing and MMA where you have your hands up here, here, and here? So I might just go to Sonny first for that and then to you, Karen, because I just want to jump on that before we jump off of that, because there might be some applicability from holding the sword.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that I hadn't even considered, because of course, yeah, I mean, one of the things I've discussed on my podcast a bunch of times is really how a lot of, grappling can be distilled down to getting the right grips and a battle of grips.
Yeah.
It really is. So I would say that there's certainly a case that you could make that it could cross over for sure.
Okay. I've changed your mind.
You've changed my mind like that.
It's easy.
It's easy.
Tune in next week where I show you how to make $1 million. Send $10 to the following address for the tips. And Kieran, what about you from a striking point of view?
See, like for me, what stood out is, and the grip on the sword, what I really like is his description of even like where the tension is on the hand. So like he's got these descriptions on like the bottom towards the baby finger having more tension, and at the top of the hand is a bit looser. So that there's, and what that feeds into is something else that he has in the book, in the book, where he describes, well, multiple places really, and the kind of this basic, it's a major essence of the book, is that we shouldn't be swinging the sword strongly or slashing weakly, but the objective is to swing the sword to kill the opponent. So it's like it's not about cutting strongly, it's not about cutting weakly, it's about cutting to kill. So it's like, so it's this sentiment of you have enough tension to get the job done, but not so much that you get in your own way.
Yeah, beautiful.
And that it's that kind of sentiment of like, because if you try and muscle a punch and you try and swing hard, you're just tense and you're just too much. Similarly, if you're too weak, it's about whatever's needed at any moment in time to get the job done. And so that's what I take from the grips, is that there's this tension, looseness towards the top of the hand for movement, and then tension towards the bottom of the hand specifically. But the reason for that is to be able to have the flexibility to do what needs to be done with the sword to get the kill when the opportunity arises.
Yeah, and that's perfect, because I did Aikido and Kenjutsu maybe 12, 13 years ago. And when I was doing, that's when I first got introduced to the Book of Five Rings, when I was learning sword. And with the bokken, they would say to hold it, and you would actually just wrap your hand around the bokken, which is like a wooden sword, around the bottom, but starting from the little finger first. So wrap like that, like you're grabbing the top of if you can imagine, if you're sitting playing the guitar and you're turning your hand and you're playing on the top part of the guitar, like what do you call it, like the fretboard, sorry, I couldn't think of it. I was going to say the stem, up the top, up there, near there where they tie the strings on. And so it's the same thing, you're wrapping your hand around, and the top part, Karen, you're right, is the loosest, where the bottom part, and that looseness there allows then the sword to be fluid, because if you're gripping too tight, then everything is, and you probably have seen this yourselves with people boxing, are like really rigid, like extending their arms trying to jab, where you want to get them nice and flowy and bouncing up and down. And the same in jiu-jitsu, Sonny, we've seen the same thing probably, where a white belt or blue belt is just like holding their arms out stiff, and you're like, that's an arm bar, because to your point, Karen, the tension by pushing me away gives me what I want. So that's what I got out of grips as well. That's yeah.
But it even lines the hand up, like from a boxing perspective, from like a force transmission perspective, when I make contact with someone, it's those front two knuckles, because if there's an even distribution of force across my hand, then the fist kind of squares off. Whereas what I want to kind of do is spear it a bit, so that there's a kind of front two knuckles make contact, so that's a slight spear, because then you end up with the biggest, what would you call them? Is it the tarsals? And not the tarsals. What are the hand bud, the carpals?
One's tarsals, one's metatarsals. I forget now which is which.
Yeah, whatever the bigger the bones here that run from the knuckles down to the wrist, they kind of align with the wrist. So that just occurred to me that there's actually a little bit more tension towards the pinky finger side of the hand, because it actually spears the hand slightly, so that I'm not landing. Because if you think about something like physics, like Pascal's law with pressure is force, force is the force over area, or where we basically want that less surface area transmitting the same amount of force. So then you end up with that force transmission from the forearms through those two big knuckles, but also so maybe that also carries across. What are they called? Phalanges. That's
phalanges.
it. It's the tarsals in the feet. It's the tarsals in the feet and the phalanges in the hands, yeah.
And metacarpal bones here in the thumb. Yeah, because the anatomy is like that.
Yeah. So that maybe that adds in that position and the kind of spearing of the hand. Because you think about if you're in the sword, if you're going from the baby finger first, that does give you that flexibility in the wrist.
Yeah,
and the point in the hand, but also even for a punch. If I'm swinging a hook and my hand is kind of square, I'm more likely to catch him with the baby finger or second last knuckle, which are the ones that I'm really likely to break on impact. Whereas if I have that kind of a spearing shape, even if it's a Russian hook or even if it's a kind of a thumb up hook or a thumb down hook, then kind of like that Cuban L swing or whatever the fuck they call it, it's those first two knuckles, the L swing.
Yes. Yeah. Lads, we're teaching people how to kill each other out here. So
that's what it's all about.
So this is a good point, actually. Did you get more of this, Sonny, that we're having this conversation about the applicability to our martial arts, or did you get more of a philosophical approach to the Book of Five Rings?
I was definitely trying to gain as much knowledge about the applicability to martial arts at the time.
Yeah.
But I think now I am more concerned with the kind of philosophical side of things as moving on to different areas of life and in terms of like not competing as much anymore and trying to and I mean that is kind of the biggest thing I took away is that like the idea of a carpenter needs his tool sharp and the right tool for the right job, that that practice of martial arts should be the way that you practice life. And that, getting good at martial arts is getting good at everything else that you put your mind to, kind of. And so that's something that I think I have tried to carry through as much as I can, but of course, always easier said than done.
Can you give a specific example that might come to mind that where you've used the Book of Five Rings in your life? Because there might be people listening to this that go, yeah, that's all well and good. Those lads are a bunch of testosterone heads talking about fighting, but how does it apply to real life? Like, is there anything you've taken out that you've applied? Because you've recently become a teacher. You're probably dealing with a lot of little shits. You've worked in IT before where you've dealt with people who said, turn it on, turn it off, all that sort of stuff. How did you use it then?
It's a legit tactic. I think one of the biggest things then for me in terms of applicability is where he's talking about the rhythm and how, knowing the rhythm in all things, the rising of people to office and the falling of people from office, and just knowing that there is that kind of cycle to be paying attention to. And it can be, you got a room full of students and just for whatever reason, you can feel that the rhythm that day is everyone's hyper and everything's going, and then you have to pay attention to it and change maybe what you're planning on doing just to accommodate those needs rather than just, fixating on what you thought was going to happen and go ahead with it. And that kind of, ability to adjust to the different rhythm of things, I'm always trying to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so important for, again, like the right tool for the right job. That could be the right punch to beat the right guard. But, it could also be a DJ playing the right song at the right moment just to make a moment special.
Yeah.
The right flower in a bouquet and just to really tie it together.
I know you're smirking there, but I think this is something actually I've actually learned in the last few months is that you don't have to do things. You don't always it's good to push yourself in different directions, but it's also good to listen to your body and listen to what you want to do. I was trying to force myself to train for a 200k run because I wanted to make a comeback to running. And I was getting really sick and run down, went to the doctor, my blood work wasn't good. And it was just killing me because obviously older now and trying to do running, do some swimming, lift some kettlebells, do yoga, do jiu-jitsu. I was trying to be Joe Rogan, and, run a business, do research, have things like this. And it's kind of like, why am I doing this? I really don't, I don't really want to do it. It's not giving me joy. It's not bringing any benefit to my life. It's making me sick. I'm constantly tired. I'm turning into an asshole. And the minute I made that decision that I'm not going to do this because it's just not, first of all, it's not bringing me joy. I'm going to go back swimming. Mood, straight back up. Felt great again. Being in the ocean, being in the pool, feeling really good, doing swimming and jiu-jitsu predominantly. And I'm like, this is what I called a rhythm. That this what, like, to me was like, just go with it. You don't have to be everything to everybody all your life. Just go with that rhythm, to your point, and understand what's happening. Go with the cycles of, seasons,
Yeah. And I think, applying it back to martial arts is, that not getting fixated on one technique in particular in a match, where if you get so I almost had this triangle choke and I'm just going to hold on to it until, the rhythm changed and the moment's gone, then you can get yourself into a lot more problems by fixating on that instead of noticing those moments and shifts in momentum and those changes, which happen, every day.
And that rhythm component, that's what I was actually going to carry it across too, because just like you'd mentioned, because what I really like in Musashi is the kind of the overall theme that he has of the objective is to get the job done in the fight, and everything else is secondary to that. Like even when he compares his sort of school fighting, the Ishii Ryu or whatever he called it, when he compared that to the other schools, he was like, these schools do this and these schools do this, but my school does whatever it takes to get the job done. So it's like, there's useless stuff over here, grand, but these schools get fixated on this technique, this school get fixated on this technique. My school fixates on killing people, which is his objective. And it's like, and it's as simple as that. He's like, it's like that Bruce Lee concept, but I'd imagine Bruce Lee was probably, because there's parts of the Book of Five Rings that reminds me of the Jeet Kune Do, that when while Bruce Lee, be water, exactly. It's like that whole thing that Bruce Lee had of the vessel, and Musashi had a concept in the Book of Five Rings somewhere. He was like, sometimes a water is just it's a drop, and sometimes it's a tidal wave, and then Bruce Lee had that, like, the water fills the cup, the water fills the jug, etc. It does whatever it needs to do. But because in, like you said that about schoolwork, there's Bruce with the glasses. Class.
I love Bruce Lee. I love it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You had just like that
on my desk the whole time.
The Hong Kong glasses. Because just like you said there with the schoolwork, like when you think about that kind of overarching meta concept when you're in a class, is probably, regardless of what you're teaching or in even a coaching session with me, the objective is to try and facilitate the learning process. But you can't impose a rigid plan down on top of something that's not what you would expected, rather than trying to, and it's like the Musashi concept of sticking to the fixed technique that I'm going to make this particular counter work in this fight, and I'm going to make this particular submission work. It's like, then you're locked in and you've created boundaries, rather than being able to go with the flow or the rhythm. And then just because the overall objective is what matters, not what you're trying to impose on it in a very kind of narrow way. Same with the DJ. Like if a DJ shows up and decides, this is my playlist and fuck the crowd, that's not really meeting the overall sentiment of what a DJ is supposed to be doing in a nightclub,
Exactly. I mean, you can't drop a heavy metal song in the middle of a 4-hour house music set unless the moment is just right,
Yeah. You can't do it unless you should do it.
Yeah.
It's like, and then the show, but then you can't predict it. Yeah. Because Musashi even has that thing about you shouldn't have any preferences. But even that, we were chatting about it, Ian, is like, but there's a fascinating paradox in there, because to want to not have any preferences is to have a preference about having no preferences. So that in itself is a fascinating little mind bender.
Yeah, that's I was reading that in the weekend. That was driving me mad. I was like, wait now. We're in a non-virtuous cycle all at the one time here. Like, what do you do? Do you do it? But I think that's what's good about that, though, then, Kieran, is from a martial arts perspective, I think, is actually to disrupt it every now and then. So a bit like I just said there about my swimming example, it might dawn upon me someday, fuck it, let's just go and run 20 Ks and see if we can do it, to disrupt it, right? Which I've often done before. So maybe it's the same thing where you go, well, I generally never roll against that person in jiu-jitsu. He generally fucks me up, but let me go over and see if I can get a sweep and then just pin him, right? Or do something completely unorthodox. It's like last week I was training with somebody and I got on top and I baseball bat choked someone, and one of the guys in the mat went, I never see you play top position. You always play like guard. I'm like, I got top game too, lads. I just take it out when I have to. And they were like, oh, fuck. And I was like, we're laughing about it. And I think that's the same. And I got that actually from reading Musashi in the last few weeks again, where I was like, I'm going to do something that nobody expects me to do. I'm going to completely like just do something out of the box. And I've been thrown in a bit lately in my own game. And it's really interesting about, because people expect you to be like, I do a lot of open guard, Sonny, triangles, ankle locks, heel hooks. And generally that's what's coming. So then if you do a sweep and you come up on top, people are like, wait, no, this doesn't seem right, because people get into that familiar pattern, like what you're saying, Kieran. So I presume, Kieran, it's the same in boxing as well, is it? And for you, Sonny, in MMA, where you would get into those predictable patterns, but then do something completely unorthodox.
But the prime example from a boxing perspective would be Floyd Mayweather just being able to do everything. He can go forward, he can go backwards, he can counter, he can be aggressive, he can put on pressure, he can ease off and counter, because he has this toolbox of really refined and varied tools at every range, close, medium, and long range, that it becomes really hard. Like, people know what he's going to do, but they don't know how to deal with all of it. There's like a certain toolbox that he has, but it's like, how can I deal with all of this? You know, and that's what springs to mind for me from boxing. What were you saying there, Sonny? Sorry, I cut you off.
I was just thinking of the points where he talks about like feinting, or I can't remember if he talks specifically about feinting, but he is talking about, causing, shock in the opponent and getting them to freeze, and then using that as moments of attack, and just how that is kind of it's so applicable in striking, where you are, looking to just get that moment. And I've felt that moment myself, where all of a sudden, an opponent takes an angle on you and you're like, oh, this is bad. And those are the times when they land the best shots, or you can land the best shots ideally if you're in that position. And just how he takes that, that description of the feeling that you want to actually instill in your opponent and make them feel a certain way, and then capitalize on that to your advantage, is kind of similar to, pulling something, having those other tools in the toolbox that you can apply at the correct moment.
And from all the analysis you've done over the years, Sonny, and all the different, how long you've been around MMA, are there any fighters that jump to mind that you think that people might know of, or MMA lads that might kind of embody that kind of style, or that kind of surprise, or surprise kind of a sentiment?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, now my latest obsession is really, what the guys are doing at City Kickboxing, with the amount of feinting that they're doing, and Volkanovsky and Max Holloway. I mean, everyone's really stepping things up in that area. And so that I love, if you can catch those moments where they've set up a feint, then they capitalize on it, and you can just see it kind of play out. That's what it's like. Oh, that was just beautiful, where it's, an interplay of just small shoulder motions, or, hand motions to set something up, and you can see the trap being laid, and then, they either fall for it, or perhaps, they don't. But those are that's really what's interesting to me at the moment. And it's such a rich area to kind of look into.
Yeah, in boxing, two guys that jump to mind that I absolutely love the style that they bring, because of how much volume they put out and everything, would be Lomachenko, Vasyl Lomachenko, and Terence Crawford as well, or Errol Spence Jr. is another guy. But like, Lomachenko is a really dramatic example because of how high his volume output is. But so much of that movement is actually misdirection and feinting, and like using misdirection and feinting to set up something that might happen a round or more later, like down the line. And it's so fascinating to watch. It's almost like a performance being built. Like, it's so beautiful to watch. Like, and whereas so much of the movement and the punches are just to touch, and not actually to do any harm, just touch him. And then just with that, setting something up down the line, it's almost like a feint, but a feint that's actually making contact, but it's just a light touch. And it's the intricacy and the level of development, and that is mind-boggling to see. Like, but there, they've seen that as well. Like, that's a brilliant example. MMA, like Adesanya from City Kickboxing, and what so much of the movement that he has is setting things up. Oh, Lomachenko, here he is, the man. This is actually, he ended up losing this fight. He went up a weight class. But he's absolutely class. His amateur record is 396-1. And he with 2 Olympic gold medals, Lomachenko. But that's him fighting Lopez. He actually went up weight class, and Lopez was just too much for him.
Showing for those people listening, we're just showing some clips here on the video version as well. So we had Lomachenko on there just to illustrate what Kieran was talking about. And now we have Volkanovsky versus Max Holloway, which was they've had 2 fights, I think. Sonny, 2 fights.
Yeah,
2 fights, and Volkanovsky's beaten him twice.
Yeah,
so you can see the feints there. There was a classic example there where he dented to the body and then went up, and just his movement, and it's interesting. Yeah. Sonny, can I ask?
See that level change feint there, that level change right hand to the body into the fake left hook upstairs to set up the outside leg kick. Like, it's so lovely.
Yeah, Sonny, you have to switch this off because I'm just going to want to keep watching.
I know we're going to start watching. But Sonny, but let me ask you a question on distancing now, because this does actually relate back to the book, and I know we go down rabbit holes. To see here Max Holloway, and this is what a lot of fighters do. Anderson Silva used to do a lot. See the way Holloway's putting out his hand and nearly kind of catching the glove. So Volkanovski's got his left hand up. Holloway's quite taller. Silva used to do this as well, Anderson Silva, back in the day when he was fighting. They kind of reach out and nearly grab the hand. Is there a purpose behind that? To me, I just feel like when they do that, when they reach forward, that they're nearly connecting themselves to the opponent and they're restricting their movement. I don't think it gives them the fluidity. Now, obviously, I'm not an MMA athlete. I'm not a striker, and I probably have no business. But as a fan, I'm asking this question. I feel like they're grabbing it and they're actually isolating that tool. They're connecting to them. Is there a rationale behind it that I'm missing?
If I can make one quick point, that's something that you see in open stance striking encounters, where it's a righty versus a lefty or a lefty righty. Like when you have that open stance where one of them is standing southpaw, the other one is orthodox. Because if we're both standing in the same stance and I extend, the hand fight doesn't really play the same role. Whereas in an open, and that's a closed stance matchup, but for both southpaw or both orthodox. But in an open stance matchup, you see southpaws particular or tall righties that are used to being a bigger opponent, they'll have that fuckery with the front hand, where they're playing with it and they're like pawing at it and touching it because they want you, because I'm a southpaw, and like I might do it, especially if I'm fighting a short or right-handed fighter, because I kind of want to fuck with his rhythm. And I want to be touching him and annoying him and taking away his jab and kind of playing with him to get him to throw the jab maybe. So if I keep taking it away from him, then when I give it back, he might be more likely to throw it, because I want him to throw a lead jab, because then I can slip outside and put the left hand down the pipe, for example.
Okay, so you're not grabbing it, you're just touching it.
Yeah, sometimes you might touch it, even like, and if I'm really touching and playing with it, like you see Yoel Romero does this a lot as well. He's that big southpaw. He'll like be touching and playing, and then I kind of sets a rhythm, and then you break the rhythm with a sudden explosion. And then Robbie Lawler would kind of do it as well as a southpaw, and you kind of touch and play. And then that touch is a certain rhythm, and then you suddenly break the rhythm, and it looks really dramatic because it's like you lull the opponent and then explode. Lull and then explode. So that's just a point I wanted to make, because it's something that I was really into when I was fighting, was like playing around with the hand fight like that.
Interesting. Never thought of that.
What do you think, Sonny?
Yeah, I think you've nailed most of what I would say as well. Maybe some difference in MMA. Technically, there you can reach out, touch the hands, and then there's an opportunity to elbow over the top of it as well.
Yeah.
So but it is, I think, the main elbow over the top. It is that main thing, I think, of setting that rhythm, and then. It can also be if I know that all I'm going to do is reach out and touch your hand, but you don't know that that's all I'm going to do, then perhaps you can confuse it with a punch and you will tense up, and then that's an expenditure of energy. Or then you do lull them into a sense of thinking all he's doing touching the hand, and then throw a real strike behind it, and then that sets them into not knowing exactly what's going to happen again, and not being sure of what exactly is going on. And of having it, I've had it happen to me too, where if you do tense up when they touch the hands, and sometimes I just want to strike back through it because it is frustrating and annoying. is just a waste of energy most of the time.
Especially when a fighter is used to hand fighting. Like you see that because only like 1 in 10 people are left-handed. A tall or southpaw, especially, or a southpaw, is going to be used to the hand fight and used to the rhythm and used to the role that a hand fight plays. Whereas that's not going to necessarily be, or sometimes it can be a right-handed fighter who happens to be really comfortable with southpaws. But it is really kind of disrupting that's as a technique. And
yeah, and the other thing is, if you do have the top hand, you do somewhat nullify their opportunity to strike back with that hand. So there can, it can act as a somewhat defensive motion too. And one of my main sparring partners through all the time I was fighting was southpaw. So, we would spend a lot of time, trying to get the top hand who's got the dominant hand, and it could wear you out if they're just hanging on that hand and you're trying to win that battle, and it can wear you down just by focusing on what's going on with the hands. And of course, while you're just focusing on the hands, then all of a sudden you've got a liver kick coming in from a southpaw too. So it is that, distraction, misdirection. There's a technical aspect to it. It's one part of the fight, but it really takes up the whole, it's the whole fight as well.
Yeah. You see that in kickboxing, Senchai was doing an unbelievable job of it. And Muay Thai, and then in kickboxing, Giorgio Petrosian, one of my favorites, and he was at his kind of that kind of rhythm he'd set with it, and then the sudden explosion is beautiful as well, and setting things up with it, and like bringing a head, and their Senchai would be like touching and playing, and the next thing all of a sudden there's a right head kick from his front leg coming up over the left shoulder of the opposition, and it's coming like whip, and it's like touching and playing, and then whip a little right hook, and then bring the right head kick up behind the right hook. In that, it's beautiful to see it playing out by real masters like that. Have you done any? Do you watch any of the, or have you seen any of the other kind of striking breakdowns, like Lawrence Kenshin and those like? Yeah,
I watched a bunch of Lawrence Kenshin ones back in the day. And in fact, I bought his new course, which I had a peek at the other day, and it wouldn't surprise me if he gets into the Book of Five Rings. He's taken a very different path nowadays. But Lawrence Kenshin, Brendan Dorman, they were the two main striking ones I watched back in the day. And BJJ Scout actually did a amazing one, a series on Dominic Cruz that I think is not on YouTube anymore, but it's well worth finding if you've never watched it, because he breaks down all of Dominic Cruz's feints and footwork, and it's beautiful.
Was that the one where he had like kind of the Willie Pep comparisons?
Yeah. It was gold.
All Willie Pep footage. Yep. And you can see the exact same footwork patterns. It's so strange to see the same rhythms and even the same, because Willie Pep was such an odd mover. Mm-hmm. So unorthodox for that time. He's such an odd mover, and then to see these exact patterns playing out with Cruz is fascinating.
Yeah. That was one of my, I think, favorite breakdowns of all time that he did there. But yeah, so those guys. I mean, I think everyone, in that when they're breaking things down, they kind of touch on it, because everyone's kind of looking to make different comparisons with classic fights and newer fights, and there is that benefit of bringing those old techniques that have previously been shown to work and reinserting them, as Ian was talking about with the rhythm of things. Certain moves, maybe more so in grappling, will go out of style, and then all of a sudden the defenses for people have waned on them, and they then become more susceptible to them working again, until all of a sudden everyone knows, Ian's got a good triangle choke. I better be on the lookout for that all the time. And then it goes away, and then it can come straight back again like trends.
Yeah. Class. An example that jumps out is from boxing, because the rules shifted in boxing and fighters weren't allowed to spend as much time in the clinch. That there was a kind of, and because there'd be kind of more often, maybe not wasn't the rules change, maybe it was the interpretation or the zeitgeist, I'm not sure exactly, but you'd see that infighting and things on the inside, like bicep blocks, overhooks, even like underhooks, and see these, like you see fighters fighting on the inside in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, where there's like underhooks, overhooks, and going from like a bicep block into a hook over the top, and then going for an overhook off the back of that. These kind of almost Greco upper body style of wrestling mixed in with the shots, and fellas would be allowed to just fight like that for prolonged periods. And you don't see that now. And maybe it's part of it is, I actually don't know if it's rule changes, or maybe a contributing factor was the gloves, the technology change of the gloves as well, where you lost the movement ability of the thumb because the thumb was stitched into the glove. I don't know, maybe that played a role as well at affecting the grappling that could be done, especially with bicep blocks and stuff like that, because you couldn't get the hand around. I'm not actually sure, but then you see that stuff being brought into, like, I remember like Risen, that organization, or Ryzen or whatever, where there was no elbows. So it wasn't like the UFC where you could elbow on the inside in the clinch. So you saw this kind of resurgence by certain fighters of like 1920s, 30s, 40s boxing, because in the clinch they weren't able to elbow, so they had to punch. So then there was like upper body Greco with punching. That was like a whole new thing that you didn't see. Even you saw bits and pieces of it kind of in Pride, but there's a whole elevation of it then when Risen came back into play, like with Crone Gracie and stuff fighting in Risen back in the day.
Yeah, and I love the Risen, the pageantry that they put on for all their fights. And I mean, the most influential fighter I can think of, at least for me, for that is Jack Johnson. Back in the day. So he was the first African-American heavyweight boxing champion, and won that title in Sydney, Australia, just down the road, on Boxing Day, which I always like to bring up around that time. But
that way it's called Boxing Day.
No, but I like to just pretend it is, because it's a cool fact. But he would fight a lot of that style. And there is a documentary actually that I watched on him. It's called Unforgivable Blackness. And there was a quote in that stood out for me, which I think relates back to a lot of what we were talking about with the feints, where it was someone talking about him, but they said that he was a magician in the ring, and that his trick was to make you assist him in giving you an ass whooping. It was, you would become the assistant in your own ass whooping.
And Jesus Christ.
And I'm like, wow, that's it. That's the goal.
Yeah, he was so brilliant puppeteering, fellas. Like, in that his hand fighting, his control, his upper body control in there, and his way he used that to control distance, and it was lovely. Even going back to watch those fights, the movement and the style that he had and the fluidity that he had, because I think I've seen that documentary as well, and he's so impressive. And he was an interesting character outside of it as well, like how he just kind of had all these death threats and all these major, like massive racism against him and everything, because he was beating up all these white guys. But yet he wasn't having it. And he had these white girlfriends, and he was driving. And it was in him that there was that story of,
that's right, about the fine,
speeding. Yeah, he got caught speeding with a speeding ticket in a sports car. And then he goes to the cop. He goes, all right, I'm going to give you double. And he's like, why? Because I'm going to catch me on the way back as well.
Yeah, an absolutely fascinating life that's just really hard to just wrap my head around when, reading about it and watching that documentary. Is just what he did was just absolutely incredible for the time, especially just everything that he had to go through. It's just an amazing fighter that I would say, I certainly would if you make a comparison to Musashi. I mean, this guy stands out as just one of the all times. Yeah,
that's a great comparison.
I've just realized how little I know about striking, and I'm just writing notes here. And this is I'm getting my reading list here for the next 6 months in Doc all this. This is absolutely fascinating to listen to, because being more of a grappler, this is fascinating to watch this. And I think Jack Johnson, I was just thinking there as you guys are talking, maybe it's just me, but Jack Johnson doesn't seem to be celebrated as much as Muhammad Ali, does he? Or is it just a time has passed? Or
he would have been, it could just be the time.
And he would have been a lot before Muhammad Ali as well. Yeah. So, like, you got to think that culturally, like Jack Johnson, like Muhammad Ali wouldn't have been able to have been Muhammad Ali if it wasn't for Jack Johnson breaking the ice and setting the table. And Jack Johnson had the kind of braggadocious personality, wore the flash clothes, drove the cars, was really well spoken, spoke his mind, kind of littered, but he'd speak his mind. There was dramatic consequences. You got to think about the time. There was literal race riots. Like black people were lynched and murdered because Jack Johnson won fights. You know, there's some crazy shit went down with these race riots.
Yeah, he was he was born in 1878, so exactly 100 years before I was born. I was born in 1978. Unforgivable Blackness, 3 hours 40 minutes. This must be a quite in-depth view, Sonny.
It's a good watch. I'm telling you. I would recommend it to everyone interested remotely in boxing or combat sports. There is a great photo of him in one of the cars, which kind of for me really clicked like exactly what time or what era he was actually fighting in, because it's just such a...
This one?
Yeah. I mean, that one, there's just like, these cars were around. Hang on. This is early days. This is early days if this is going, you know? And so it's just fascinating to think what he went through.
Sometimes I wish we still got around like this. Look how dope that is. Look at that. Cigar in the mouth, driving gloves, open top. Look at the goggles. Look, people all wore suits. It's a bit like a Guy Ritchie movie, isn't it? Like when Guy Ritchie talks about the suit on Rogan. It's been taken away from us. This is kind of cool. Would you like this, Kieran? Would you like to go back dressed like this?
Oh man, he was an absolute legend. Would you? But as a in relation to that era, Sonny, would you have any? Look how jacked he was. Oh my God, what a fucking athlete! But would you have any insight, Sonny? Because what blows me away with this era was because nowadays there's like this exponential growth in technique. Like you could use jiu-jitsu as an example, where something like Instagram and YouTube over the last 5, 6, 10 decade, maybe years, and 5, 6, 10 years are like the exponential growth in technique because of how easy it is to get footage of fights and how easy it is to get breakdowns and technique videos, and like the content like you produce or Lawrence Kenshin, like this kind of stuff with these really technical breakdowns that show these minute details and are not obvious, because you're kind of highlighting the components of like the less than obvious bits, like the bits between the obvious bits, you know, like you're kind of showing the bits between the obvious stuff and how this is actually done and layered on and set up with certain techniques, etc. So like, but when you look back at these videos in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and these old fights, and obviously they didn't have the same, they didn't have the sharing of information on a mass scale. So that leads me to think, well, I'm really curious about how they actually trained and the level of craft in the training and the level of detail and technical nuance in the coaching. Because I wonder, have you ever looked into, like there's one really good book called Boxing by this fella, Edwin Hazlitt, that was published in 1935 that I read years ago. And it's just really cool, just like an instruction manual for coaching boxing, but published by this high school boxing teacher in the US in 1935. And it's fucking brilliant. Like the principles, the rules of boxing have slightly changed, like the things with the clinch and everything, but the principles still stand, you know? And I was wondering if you knew anything about any of the way that they trained and how they prepared and how that maybe alters to today. Like you just take boxing as an example. Because I can't help but think one particular thread that changed things to me was the equipment, that the bigger sparring gloves and the headgear maybe then meant that hard sparring ended up playing more of a role than it might have done then. And maybe also similar to how Thai boxing works in Thailand, that they fight so often they don't need to spar as hard in training because they're getting so much access to fights, or that they always spar hard and then just end up developing more craft. Or I suppose I'm after firing a load of information at you, but I'm legitimately curious about preparation for them back then versus now, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't have maybe as much specifics as I could. I do have actually a copy of that book, Boxing by Edwin Hazlett.
Yeah,
just behind me.
cool.
I haven't read it in a while, and I'm thinking I might go back and give it a browse. But I mean, I know in that the Unforgivable Blackness documentary, they do go through quite a lot of detail against his opponent, whose name's escaping me at the moment, who came out of retirement to fight him again.
Who's opponent? Jack Johnson.
Jack Johnson's. Yeah.
Jack Johnson. He fought. There's an Australian comedian by the same name. There's an Australian
Jim Jeffries.
Jim Jeffries. That's his the famous one. He had 2 fights with, I believe. And then there's a lot of training footage in the movie on that, of him coming out of retirement and preparing. And it seems like, I mean, what you see is kind of, I guess, put on for the media with sparring and just moving around. And they do move in, a funny looking way in comparison to what we know as boxing today. But there's also a story of, there was a catch wrestler who was in that training group, who I think had challenged some people some of the boxers to a wrestling match and put them on show kind of in that regards. So I think, it was kind of these, small groups coming in together and doing a lot of sparring. But that's something that certainly could look into a bit more.
Yeah, because even the equipment, like when you see the different style of fighting, because like you can see there's a picture there of Jim Jeffries. I think it might have been Jeffries with Jack Johnson.
It was, yeah.
And the gloves are basically just like bag mitts with a bit of horsehair inside in it. You can almost see Jack Johnson's knuckles through the front of the gloves. They're basically doing a boxing match in MMA gloves, in terms of how thin the gloves are. Like you can see, it's like that second in from you see how small those gloves are. So then if you imagine in terms of like even defensively, your options are different in terms of what you're like, because when I have the big, if I've got even the pro boxing 10-ounce gloves on, the amount of my head that covers when I put them up is a much greater, and my movements, I can make much smaller movements and still block a punch with an actual block. But then you take into the fact that his hand is also bigger because he's got the glove on. So then, whereas you think about that difference in an MMA and how we have to defend ourselves differently with MMA gloves on than a defense you get away with the big 10 or 12 or 6, especially 16-ounce sparring boxing gloves on, that the amount of movement and the size of the gaps is so much bigger with an MMA glove on, that would like the style of defense. That's partially maybe why they're moving in such an odd way with this long range and the kind of hands out, because they can't actually just put the hands up like you'd see modern day boxers or Olympic boxers doing. Yeah.
And that's something that Johnson would do, is just he would smother the opponents with his reach and just cover their hands and move into a clinch. Which wasn't the most exciting style for a lot of people, but he, kept him safe, kept him winning. Yeah. So,
and you can see that in the image that Ian just had up on the screen. Could you bring that page back up, Ian? That you just had up there, and there was one of the images that was really cool that kind of captured a kind of a grappling component to this. That
this one, no.
So on the images on the right hand side of the screen, so you see on the right hand side, there's there and there. If you scroll down a little bit, to see the image where they're in the clinch, just here. There. So it says SCI, and look at the way that Johnson has defensive responsibility in that image. His right hand has an overhook and he's grabbing the elbow, and his left hand, he's across the front of the bicep and pinning the bicep down with a bicep block so that he can't come over the top of the right hook. So even in the clinch, he's utilizing these lovely upper body wrestling kind of like body control, arm control positions. So like when he was inside, he was all about basically puppeteering the opponent and steering him. And you see the way that he'd grab, he'd go bicep block, and then he'd go over the top to the tricep and pull him off balance a bit, then throw a shot, then go back into the clinch again. Yeah. It's so cool.
Do you know what's fascinating about that, Kieran? And obviously, again, I want to reiterate, I'm not a striker. I never have been a striker. I've done a little bit of boxing, a bit of kickboxing, more for fun. But this is actually, and Sonny, you might relate to this, this is something you would do in no-gi grappling, standing up. You would trap that arm, you would push on the bicep instead of fighting the hand, because once you get them like this, it's nearly like a scarecrow. Or, Sonny, if you're lying on your back and you're doing some form of spider guard or trying to wrap that arm and control it to attack that arm, his left arm, the opponent, not Jack Johnson, but this one, and then you would push on the bicep to create space. It's nearly the same thing, but imagine Jack Johnson was lying on his back, Sonny, or Kieran. Yep. It's the very same thing. It's funny how sometimes when you look at opposite things like grappling on the ground versus striking, that the similarity, and a bit like what Musashi says, once you see the way, once you understand the way, you'll see it in everything. And this is a prime example of that, where you're seeing the similarities, or, things like, I don't know, like an ankle lock. I said to somebody recently, an ankle lock is like doing a guillotine. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, when you do a guillotine, your hand is like that, and you grab this. When you do a straight ankle lock, your hand is like that. And they're like, so just think about guillotine, and you want to squeeze and guillotine, the ankle. And they were like, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that. So try and look for the familiarity or the same things everywhere. Suddenly you're laughing and like totally off there.
No, it's exactly right. I'm actually thinking about one of my favorite sayings at the moment, kind of hinting at the same thing, when we're practicing on fence wrestling or wall wrestling, for MMA, is that you just got to think of the wall is just a vertical floor, guys, Yeah. But if you actually look at fence wrestling or wall wrestling, it's pretty much, you take guys half guard games and you can kind of just put it onto the fence and work from there. And I mean, the way I look at it is, because definitely you bang on, is it's kind of like the spirit of combat is the same, and it's just the rules, the equipment, and the terrain that will change how it's represented, but it's all the same thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to switch tact a little bit, because Kieran, you've actually kind of segued into this about this defensive mannerism in stand up here for boxing. Sonny, in the book, Musashi talks about different types of guards. And I just want to read what he says. He says the 5 kinds of guards are the upper position, the middle position, the lower position, the right-hand guard, and the left-hand guard. So I read that and I thought, a bit like old school karate, for those of you doing Shotokan, the high block, the middle block, the low block, the right block, the left block. With swords, you can do the same thing as well. There's like what's called gate block. So when you see those temples in Japan, they have this thing over the top. You can do that same kind of block with a sword with your hands as well. Obviously, you don't cut yourself, but you grip and you push. It's called gate block up the top. But there's also blocks in different positions, or swinging the sword out to the side to defend from left and right. How important do you think, Sonny, is the uses of guards in terms of applying them to MMA, and what kind of guards from this book have you kind of brought across to MMA? Because obviously, if you do a high guard, you're exposed for those liver shots or body shots. If it's a low guard, you're exposed for the head shots. So how do you find the balance in terms of knowing what guard to apply and when?
That is a good question, because for me, I mean, my takeaway, the main takeaway I remember from that is when he mentions that every guard is like a purpose to kill. So it's like, it's not just defensive, like the guard itself is a means of attack. The guard is a means to kill. And that for me, that really stood out for me of a way of thinking of it. In terms of like the technical styles for the takeaway, again, I just like most people having fights should just have a good high guard of just covering the head and then build out from there. But what I've noticed recently is that if you actually change your guard as well, if you change a guard, there's a likelihood that your opponent could react and also change their guard as well. So that the easiest example to point out is if you often go to a high guard, bring both hands up to your temple, there's this chance that your opponent will often do the same thing, because just like, he's bringing his hands up, I better bring mine up too. And that's then you're setting the rhythm of the interaction, and you're setting the rhythm of the fight. If you can then cycle through some different guards, then that can also give, cause the opponent to not be aware of or sure of what's happening, to unbalance them a bit, to make them second guess. And so that is something that's I've been thinking about at the moment.
So your guard can influence what they have as a guard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can nearly use that in the same way as a feint in boxing. Like we're looking at Volkanovsky. You can do something, for example, in grappling, you can put your hands at your neck to defend your neck. If you're lying on your back, but the minute then they go, all right, he's blocked. Maybe, they might do something. That's when you can actually strike from that position, from that kind of striking in defense. And this probably this kind of segues into another thing I wanted to ask you about this evening, which was you recently interviewed Craig Jones, who is on the Ultimate Fighter show at the moment with Volkanovsky as well. You've probably known Craig for a while. I've grappled with him when he was a blue belt, when he was with Loughlin's in Melbourne. We all kind of move in the same circles. And we've seen the rise of Craig over the last few years. Now he's in the States with the Danaher Death Squad. When you see a guy like him that's come along to those top levels of grappling, and he's accelerated really quickly, and you see what he's doing, is there anything you can see in an athlete like him where he has used maybe deception or timing or rhythm from a grappling perspective to potentially to get to where he's got more using more cerebral as opposed to more power based?
Yeah, look, the first thing that comes to mind is actually his whole social media presence could be his best form of deception at the moment with his, which I think now does, would have to play into it, of just maybe people might take him as less of a threat potentially than he actually is, because he, kind of understated, joking, comedic, just having fun, but he's also a very serious competitor who, if you take him lightly, if you take him at the jokes, if you think he's coming to muck around, then he's tricked you because once the match starts, he's not. So
have you rolled with him, Sonny?
No, and I'd probably be horrific if it did.
I rolled with him when I was a blue belt. Liv Giles, Loughlin's wife, was like a blue 4. Just gives you an idea of what was in the gym. Craig was a purple belt and he was about 78 kilos. And it was in the old place in Paran in Melbourne, where it's like an old shop. I think Loughlin had just taken over from Kit Dale. And I rolled with him and he fucked me up like instantaneously. Like he was just so long, like just kept triangling. There was no leg locks at the time really getting done. It was like 2013. He just kept triangling me over and over again. And then, or he was in Perth a few years ago, just when he started getting famous, I suppose, like when he fought Gordon Ryan with that crazy armbar thing. And he was in Perth and he was doing a seminar and he was quite bigger. And even just doing technique with him, I was like fucking tapping. Like I did a private with him and I was tapping because like, even when he was showing you just the difference in the strength and the weight and the power and just his use of angles, and it was just crackers like this to feel that. Like it was just unbelievable. You just know like you wouldn't get anywhere near him. So it's quite interesting. I think you're right. He's using deception in terms of like what Musashi did. And Kieran, I'm going to hand it over to you to tell that story about Musashi and the shaping of the oar. Can you just tell people about that little story? Because this was actually is a parallel to what Craig Jones is probably doing with social media.
Oh, I actually meant to ask Sonny about this because that was something that Musashi, and he doesn't necessarily talk about it in the Book of Five Rings that jumps to mind, but again, the sentiment overarching everything Musashi does and says is along the lines of do whatever it takes to get the win, to get the kill of the opponent. And then some of the stories that came off the back about it was some of the duels was, one of them was this famous one where he was going out to have an old fight to the death with a lad on an island. And on the way there, he just kind of pulled out his short sword and just was dicking around, carving this oar that was broken ore that was in the boat that was bringing him out. And then ended up leaving his swords in the boat and taking the oar into the fight. And showing up, and eventually I can't remember the guy's name that he killed, but he basically cracked this. Let your man use a real sword, and he used the wooden one, and ended up cracking his head open with this wooden sword. And that kind of mental game as it relates. And he'd do other things, like he'd show up to fights. That I read some stories about him showing up to duels late on purpose just to piss off and get the other fella kind of emotionally riled up because he happened to know or hear about the fact that this guy was kind of so culturally conservative and very like on the button, T's crossed, I's dotted, so that for Musashi to show up was such a mark of disrespect. He knew it would fluster the fella. So
Kieran, that's actually, I'm just going to try something on the screen. His opponent was Sasaki Miyamoto Musashi in a famous samurai. His last duel at the age of 28 against Kojori Sasaki. It is said that he defeated him with a wooden sword he carved out of a paddle of a rowboat, which brought him to the scene.
Yeah,
I think he was late to that. He was late to that one too.
Yeah. Do you know who reminded me of that? Actually, it was a few years ago. Conor McGregor. He showed up late to a few press conferences, and I thought he's doing like a Musashi here. Whether he's doing it on purpose or his coach has told him. I often wonder, like with McGregor, is someone telling him like, is John Kavanagh? Because John Kavanagh is quite an interesting guy, engineer, quite, I think quite cerebral, quite probably. Very different than Conor. I wonder if he's going to him, look, Conor, this is what you do. This is how you make yourself. I just wonder if he has or hasn't. Maybe he hasn't. Maybe that's just who Conor is. I'm not sure. But he's done that. He's shown up late for bouts before, and it's completely, especially with Aldo, he drove Aldo mad with deception.
Yeah. Like
he got Aldo to the point where Aldo nearly fucking puked on his lap, get into that ring because he wanted to kill McGregor. The things he did, like talking about deception and annoyance and rhythm and unbalancing, he fucked with him for ages. Like he was a mastermind at doing it.
Yeah,
I don't think Conor needed too much. I don't think he needs too much help to come up with this stuff. Like, I've got some stories I can tell you when the mics turn off.
But that's the other thing. That's the other thing, Kieran, as well. Like, living here in Australia, people go, "Oh, Conor McGregor." I'm like, lads, I know about 50 people are like McGregor. I went to school with 50 people, and I can tell you the other thing as well is that the lads from Dublin are even better than the lads down the country are. They're great at talking smack. Dubs are brilliant at it. There's a few dubs where we train, and they're fucking hilarious. Like, it's brilliant. And it's just banter, and so people think that's all orchestrated with McGregor. Like, McGregor doing that thing, I'd like to thank absolutely fucking no one. Like, I've heard people do that before in bars, in a fight, and then they get up and be like, "Oh, sorry, I just want to apologize to fucking no one," and give the finger and walk out the door. I've seen guys do that. That's like their old tricks, like they're good, and they worked really well. So, it's right. We're going to wrap up the podcast now and listen to these stories. Goodbye.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, one thing from that Craig interview, and then with Conor McGregor, and you say, there's lots of him, but he's the one who kind of rose through the ranks and had the skills to back it up. But he's the one there, and I also think it's kind of like Musashi being, the one who's kind of survived and made it through all these sword battles to be the one to write the book that we're talking about. And then one thing from the Craig interview that stood out for me is when he described John Danaher not being able to roll anymore or not compete, puts him as a mythical character that he can look up to and put his trust in. And I kind of think like, well, that's kind of the same as this, when I'm reading Musashi, I'm thinking this guy is he's a historical character, but I am also reading him looking at it as a mythical character.
Can I one question on that, man, is that like, so something that Musashi, like that, what reminded me of this question was the fact that on the fight there with Kojiro, Musashi was 28 at the time. And he writes in the Book of Five Rings how at the beginning of it, that he writes how he didn't really understand the way of the warrior until he was in his 50s. And then he was writing these insights down while he was in his 60s, meditating in this cave and just writing because he was coming towards, he reckoned maybe it was the end of his life, and he ended up dying eventually pretty soon after finishing the book. But so like, just as you said, he's someone who went through the ranks and had this big career as a fighter, and then afterwards realized what it was that he might have been doing that led him to be successful. But at the time, he wasn't consciously aware of what he was doing. So did you yourself have any parallels there? Because you had this career in competitive jiu-jitsu and MMA, and where now you're realizing things that you were doing that at the time you didn't. You just did them because of almost by an evolutionary selection pressure on certain traits that you ended up doing, but not realizing you were actually doing them, that were good or ideal, like good ones, or even ones that you were doing that you didn't realize were actually harming you, that you'd love to be able to maybe coach yourself of then to go, look, man, let's change this, or we're going to keep this.
Yeah, definitely looking back at the things that I had done wrong, then probably more things than Musashi had done right. Let me say that. But like 100%, I look back and I sometimes think that what I'm doing now when I'm trying to coach people is somehow make amends and kind of rectify some of the things that I felt I had done wrong, and use the hindsight to, try and fix those, or just at least minimize them in other people. Because some of the things I was doing wrong is still this, everyone just has that natural inclination. I think part of it was that like the feeling that I had to potentially, like I wouldn't never be getting the best training unless I could go overseas, or I had to get, pull in something else from an external source, because that's where all the good stuff was going on. And, and we were doing all right with our gym, but really to take it to the next level, we've got to, bring in something else, which I think was just generally a waste of resources that could have been spent just focusing on training, instead of ever thinking about what could have possibly, who you could possibly go to see or something like that. So that's a big thing that still comes up, where people are thinking, everyone has that thought basically. And one thing I do like to talk about with, Robert Whittaker and Alexander Volkanovsky is they have, they've stayed pretty, local, homegrown. They've got the championships, and they never had to go to a big camp kind of thing.
And you can see the flip side of it as well. Like, look how many of these super gyms have kind of come and gone over the years in MMA in particular. Really famous examples of, like, where you have a load of top-notch fighters all come together to train,
like Black
and the dynamics don't work. Black Zillions is an archetypal example, where there's a bit of success, but that's because the fighters are already class. Whereas, and you just take a McGregor example, where like he'd literally come from a shed in Dublin, and there was a group of them training together, and then he came in and literally shocked the world and had these massive ripples. And like, that was an interesting insight that I had as well, in a similar thing of, like, I did some really, really, really good. I had some excellent training. I was living in America. I spent most of 15 and 16 living in America, and I trained with I had some great coaching and great training partners. Like, I trained in Sit Yad Tong in Boston with Mark Del Grotti's camp there, and there's a few of the guys who I was training with then that are in the UFC now and had been in the last couple of years. And then there was and other organizations as well, like CES and Bellator and stuff. And then I trained in San Francisco in Gil Melendez's place in El Nino, and I had some great training there. There's a Thai fella called the Wooden Man, and I trained with Jake Shields, and got to train with some really cool guys, again from Bellator, and some pro kickboxers, like guys like who fought in Glory, like Xavier Vigny, who was a pro boxer as well. He's like 6'11". Like, I have pictures of him, and it makes me look like a child. And I'm 6'2", 6'3", and 100 kilos, and this fella made me look like a toddler. But what a big thing I realized, like, I definitely got some really good technical coaching and just interesting insights. But I also kind of realized, when I saw how they were training, these highest level guys like Shields and Melendez, that the technical stuff is one thing, but so much of martial arts is just having a development. Is, of course, there's the knowledge and there's certain technical cues, but it's also having training partners that you trust and trust you, that are willing to work with you and are willing to drill with you and willing to explore things and willing to mind you in training while you're exploring things, and not take advantage and not take the piss. And at the same, and also are able to help you when you need to be pushed, and are also able to correct errors and have honest conversations with you. And then if you have those kind of things, that's what's most important. And coaches, the same. Coaches that aren't dogmatic, that are willing to work with you rather than impose some kind of authoritarian, this is the way we fucking do it here kind of a mentality. And then when you have that, that's what's actually the foundation. And then after that, then, okay, now we can look at, well, okay, what technical stuff, maybe we might need to travel somewhere to get access to, like if you're in Ireland, maybe a few years ago, it might be worth your while to travel somewhere where there was wrestling coaches, you know, to get exposure to specific technical knowledge that was really hard to get access to, for example. But for the most part, like the base, when I saw how these top level guys were performing, it was they had training partners that they trusted and trusted them, that they genuinely had each other's interests at heart, and they had coaches that were work with them and not impose on them. And in those kind of scenarios seem to be the kind of soil from which really good growth can come.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. Actually, that's exactly what I think is the most important part, because for me, it's that it was the thoughts that I was having that were, everyone would say, you got to go here or there or do this or that. And just even having that level of doubt in my mind would have made me a worse fighter, basically. Just that doubt that maybe I should be going somewhere else instead of just being content and just taking advantage of the good coaching and, good teammates and, building that culture. It's just as far more important, I think, in the long run, to actually just have that, exactly what you described, where good training partners that you can work with, try things with, who can push you when need be, can work around you. That's just such an important thing to then be able to develop the technical skills on top of.
I think that's really, really important, Sonny. And what you were talking about there, Karen, as you were talking, Karen, the word kept popping into my head, cultivating culture, because people would view this as you go in there and, you want to go in there and you show you're dominant and you're this and you're that and you're the other. But in actual fact, it's the opposite that happens. People look after you. People don't hurt you. A good gym, you won't get hurt. Yes, accidents happen and there's kind of physiological issues that will occur, but no one will, go to break your neck, really. So that's a sign of a good place to go and train. And I think that's really what martial arts is. And I think in Musashi, towards the end of his life, was probably getting at that point as well, about how you can see it in everything and how it can change your life. And I think, we'd all probably allude to that in this call about this is why we probably all do what we do, is because you do grow, you do change your life, you change your perspectives, you try new things, you're continuously learning, you're under pressure, you're in control, you're the top dog, you're the bottom of the shit heap, it's just, you're everything at once. And that can be in one session, or it can be in one role, it can be in one sparring, it can be in, 1 week, and it transcribes to everything. And the problems you solve there, are applicable to your life. Because I often think myself when I'm in a meeting, and some guys, banging on about something, I think, well, this isn't as bad as having fucking 100 kilo, black belt sitting in mount squashing you into the mat. So I'll just laugh and roll with this as well, like I do there, So it's, lessons are transferable and applicable to all parts of life, and culture is so important. And I think for me, and with the Book of Five Rings, the overarching thing I got about it was, a passion and commitment to lifelong learning, continuous improvement, having the right culture, within yourself in terms of that, and then setting that culture as well. And I think as we progress in our respective martial arts, it's up to us to set that tone and culture and direction for people coming behind, and not be fucking assholes, so to speak, and help people learn and grow as we did. Because we all probably had good and bad experiences, and we remember the good ones and want to forget the bad ones. So yeah, I think there's a lot more lessons out of Book of Five Rings. So than just, how to punch and how to grab and how to block. And whilst there are cool things to know about, there's other things that are applicable.
Yeah, bang.
I love that. The Musashi had that line. I love that line. The way is in training. Is that line? And he keep coming back to that. And there was one other concept actually that I really liked, which relates exactly to this. And this kind of grass is kind of greener mindset that it's very easy to have, especially in the modern day kind of scenario where we get access to these video blogs from training camps and see all, like for the last 10, 15 years, you get to see how these certain pro fighters prepare on YouTube training vlogs and this kind of stuff. But it's like the big thing that Musashi emphasized in the Book of Five Rings towards the beginning was that he never had a master, that he was his own master and tried to this guided self-exploration. It didn't mean he learned from people, but they weren't his master. He was his own master in terms of how he was guiding his own development. And that personal responsibility for your own development, and not to have this grass is always greener kind of dependency mindset.
That's a very interesting point, Kieran. And before we wrap up, I just want to touch on that, because I was having this conversation on the mats on Sunday about the levels in jiu-jitsu, for example. And so when you're a white belt and a blue belt, it's like you're going to uni and you want to go to as many lectures as you can. They could be classes, because you want to, get as many techniques, or get exposed to as many techniques or as many ideas. Purple belt then is like when you graduate from uni, you kind of go, right, I did my final year focusing on economics and engineering, so I kind of know what I want to do. So at purple belt, I focus really on, using my example again, open guard triangles and heel hooks, for example. And then when you get to a brown belt, you're putting that system together, not just with that, but with other things as well. You're taking the concepts of engineering and economics with science and philosophy, and you're putting that together. And it's around this time then when, as a brown belt, you start getting more responsible for your own learning. And I think the journey from brown belt to black belt is more like I'm writing my thesis. It's like being a PhD student. I'm putting all my body of knowledge together, whether I'm a coach, whether I'm a on the mat coach, setting the culture, whether I'm a competitor. It's me bringing everything I've learned over the last 6, 8, 10, 12 years together into a thesis, and how I can move to that next level. But knowing, just like a PhD, when you finish it, you realize that you know fuck all about it anyway. And I think, Sonny, you'd probably allude to this as well. As a black belt, you kind of feel like you've gone right back down to zero. So a couple of my mates are getting promoted to black on Saturday, and they're like, I feel like I know nothing. And I went, that's good, because that's what happens when you come out of a PhD. You think you know everything, but you actually know nothing about nothing. What do you think about that concept, Sonny?
I think, I'm probably still the white belt at the undergraduate uni bar is probably where I'm at, not the not doing any thesis. But I think that there is that. For me, the one I refer to is actually the old Chamber of the 30 Master. Legend of Master Killer. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Master of the 36 Chambers, where the old Kung Fu film where he goes through the training process, and the 36th chamber is leaving the temple and then teaching, going out into the world and leaving the actual, the dojo or the Shaolin temple in this case. And it's kind of like, to progress, you can't just be focused on that one place. You've got to expand and keep going, and is the actual goal. Not the plaque or the certificate or the belt or anything like that. The actual goal is to keep going, and if you can do that, then that's the real achievement.
Yeah, totally agree with you, man. Yeah, because so many, I think there's two places where people go missing in jiu-jitsu: blue belt and then black belt. Seen a lot of black belts just go, oh well, sort of drop off.
That's Kieran, one flashy concept I really love is just this reiteration, the concept that, for me, my interpretation was his kind of view that mastery is not a goal you reach, it's a process you embody and live out. It's mastery is an ongoing, ever becoming. It's not a thing you ever are. It's a process that you're on.
I think that's a beautiful way to end this, Kieran. Right. Cool. Sonny Brown from the Sonny Brown Breakdown. If people want to find out about you, Sonny, where do they go? Where do you live? Can they come to your house and talk to
you? Look, the website, sonnybrown.net. Yep. Instagram is Sonny Brown Breakdown, which I'm pretty active on, and Facebook too. And you can shoot us an email if you'd like, sonnybrown@gmail.com. And thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, Kieran, for having me on. It's been a wonderful discussion with two very learned gentlemen as yourselves.
Oh no, we're just two monkeys in a cave, man. That's all we're doing. We're just walking around in circles here in the dark. Let me ask you this, Sonny, before you go. I got one of your rash guards, protect your neck. When I got it and pulled it out of the wrapper, I thought, I'm not wearing this. It's like fucking rubber. It's so thick. I put it on. Hold on, let me finish now. Don't jump. Okay. I put it on and I said to my wife, that's the best rash guard I ever had. It's the only rash guard I've been able to wear under a jiu-jitsu gi. Every time I wear a rash guard under a jiu-jitsu gi, I feel like I'm getting waterboarded. I have panic attacks. I wore your one 2 weeks ago and I thought, that looks like it's a wetsuit, but that actually is the best rash guard I ever had. Are you making more of them?
Yeah, there is going to be more. There's going to be another design coming too, and you can get them from it's jitsi.club, and that'll be the next one will be coming soon. And yeah, I'm glad that it was a compliment, because I did receive, it's the first complaint about the style, but from everything that I'd been hearing, it is the best quality rash guard that
it's awesome.
Yeah.
So good. It's so breathable, actually. You think it would be the opposite way around when you touch it first, but it's not. It's the other way around. And Sonny, you are going to you're making a DVD for BJJ Fanatics as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that before you go?
Yeah. So I've actually filmed it, and I'm unhappy with some of the little technical details. So I'm going to go back and do it again. But it's all on Kesugatami, scarf hold, the position that's often overlooked. But I've certainly tried to present the information in a unique way, and tried to, add different elements of, teaching styles into the actual instructional to make it, somewhat unique. So you'll learn about this position that maybe you're interested in, or not many people have covered, but there'll also be some things to maybe experiment with how instructionals are presented, say, nothing too radical though.
Yeah. And t-shirts, Sonny, t-shirts on the way?
T-shirts, they're going to be at jitsi.club too, and then I'm going to have some more coming down the line. Look, what's all this stuff I got going on? What's happened?
You're doing it, not me. Like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you're asking me about what you're doing. That's bizarre. Like, what the fuck?
I'm just sitting around thinking I'm just, just punching on in the, in a padded room with a bunch of people, and now we got all this stuff going. It's crazy.
There's always somebody watching you, Sonny. Right, Sonny, hold the line for 2 seconds. Kieran, any parting words for our guest today or our listeners?
For Sonny, just thanks very much for this chat. It was brilliant. And for anyone else who hasn't seen any of Sonny's breakdowns, they're absolutely class technical breakdowns of fights. And he did one on one of my favorite fighters, Fedor Emelianenko, that I'd recommend checking out for anyone who's an MMA fan. And then I've listened to a bunch of Sonny's podcasts as well. And there's one in particular with, I can't remember the guy's name, Pritt? Yeah. Is it Pritt Mickelson, is it? Yeah. That there was one you did with him that you had a 20-minute clip of on YouTube. And then I went and listened to the whole episode that I really liked, where he was talking about essentially that there's treating jiu-jitsu more like a sport in the training process, and particularly going into the kind of the role of drilling, and the way kind of drilling can be more competitive, and that the drilling itself can be more sport-like, to try and plug that gap between the open skill practice of or the closed skill practice of a particular move, and then you can have everyone in the room of black belt all the way to white belt all drilling an armbar, but from different levels, all the way from the completion phase to some kind of a setup beforehand from a guard pass or whatever, to eventually setting it up. And the way that he layered it out, I thought was a really thought-provoking conversation for someone. Like, I don't coach jiu-jitsu, but I've coached boxing in the past, but I work as a strength and conditioning coach in coaching rugby as well. So those concepts are applicable regardless of the sport. They're like, there's these meta learning concepts that are for any coach to entertain. It would work for any sport. So I just wanted to highlight that. There's that podcast in particular jumped out at me is really cool.
Yeah, no, I'd second that as well. Excellent podcast. Excellent. All right. Thanks very much, guys. We'll see you when you're dead.